Okay, folks, so here is your weekend assignment, or at least a demo of your weekend assignment. There's a bunch of rules that are here, and I'll show you what I ended up creating with this. But I don't want you to get intimidated by it because there's really a bunch of different pieces, and you really can start out with some simple functionality and build it out. So again, this wasn't built in one shot. I started with something simple and then ended up building it out. But the bottom line is that we really have two entities. We have a salesperson who's got a name, and we've got regions. And when I say, I sort of hesitated when I said two entities because the regions are fixed. They're not going to be changing. So you have a north, a south, and an east, and a west region, and they don't change, meaning that you don't necessarily have to create them as a model in Mongoose. I didn't create them as a model in Mongoose. They're not going to change. They're just an array of 4 possible regions. Again, as a feature, at some point, we could build out a feature that said, hey, look, we're going to be able to add regions and that sort of thing. So what ends up happening here is I could add an employee, and I could give the employee a region. Now, one thing that you'll notice here, and again, this is not functionality that you have to start out with. This is assuming you can end up adding people to the list and that sort of thing. But you have no ability to save this guy unless you end up giving him at least one region. You could give more than one region as well. And there's some additional functionality which says that once someone ends up getting 3 regions, they can't have a 4th region. Okay? Again, that's not critical functionality, but I'm just sort of showing it to you here. When I click on Save, I'll see the user will end up showing up here. So you have the ability to take somebody and basically create a salesperson. Some other functionality here is the same sort of thing. If I wanted to add this guy to the south, I can't do it because he's got 3 regions. Now I can add him to the south. Other functionality that's here is that you see this guy is green. He's green because he's got 3 territories that's considered optimal. That means he's fully working. Again, nothing wrong with this. Every time that I end up making this change over here, this is reflected back into the database. You can see this as I end up saving this. So this employee or salesperson is saved whenever I end up doing this. Notice I can't delete the employee. So there's a rule that says, hey, look, if an employee has regions, you can't delete him. Once I end up getting rid of all his regions, I can delete him. Now again, those sorts of rules, they would be the absolute last thing that I would worry about. I would start out with this by just being able to add an employee and not even necessarily worrying all that much about the region. So your first, if I was building this out as a feature, I would say, hey, can I put something in a text box? I wouldn't even have these regions to start out with, and can I save them? Will they end up showing up here? And do I have the ability to delete them? Okay, that would be my starting point. And if you do that and you set it up and it's set up tightly, that's great. If you have a very busy weekend, I would still expect you to be able to do that. And I would do that by having one controller and one factory. I wouldn't get fancy. You don't need multiple controllers here. You could do this with one controller and one factory. Let your factory deal with the back end and let your controller deal with, talking to the factory and setting up the models and that sort of thing. So some other things here, let's just try to think. So I could go and add people. I could add Larry. I could add Curly. And again, I'm displaying these in a certain way. I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about the presentation until you have things working. Once you're able to insert employees, then you could think about how you're going to have this functionality in terms of setting the regions. And I would start out with not worrying about editing. I would see, hey, look, can I put some kind of buttons down here so that when I end up putting an employee in here, can I, select a region, and can I add it. Okay? So that would be the second thing that I would end up doing. And if you see yourself writing a ton of code, you're probably doing too much. Again, you have these 4 regions. You can store these 4 regions. You don't even have to store them necessarily on the server. They could be on the client side. Hint, you could put a method on a factory that when you ask for the regions, it gives you an array of 4 regions. And you're going to have to do a little bit of work here. It's not a lot of code, but you're just going to have to sort of figure out how you end up tracking with this new employee what regions the employee ends up having. And it's not incredibly complicated, but you're just going to have to sort of think it through. So in terms of building it out, the first thing you want to do, can you get an employee in the system? Once you get an employee in the system, can you end up selecting some regions and get that salesperson into the system with those regions? Once you're able to do that, then your next step would be, hey, look, once a salesperson is in here with these regions, can I end up going in here and can I modify the regions? Okay? And then after you're done with all that, then you could look at some of these other rules, these ideas of someone not having 4 regions, the idea of not being able to delete them if in fact they have any regions, the idea that, I'm showing this guy in red because he's got no regions, so it doesn't serve much of a purpose, so I could end up deleting him. And the key here is also, I would get your route set up first. That would be the first thing that I would do before you're actually looking at your web page itself. I would end up getting, I would get the route set up. So, set up a model. It's going to be a very simplistic model. Doesn't have to be all that complicated. The model's got to have 2 things. It's got to have a name, and it's got to have a collection of these regions, which are really nothing more than strings. But I would get the model set up. I would end up getting your route set up, and I would do simple, RESTful routes. You really only need 4 routes for this exercise. You need a route that's going to end up getting your sales team. You're going to need a route that's going to delete someone on the sales team. You're going to get a route that's going to end up updating someone on the sales team. And you're going to have to get a route that's going to insert someone on the sales team. So simple, RESTful routes. You could get them set up. You could get them set up with a test, or you could get them set up very easily by using Postman. And I would get those routes set up, and you should feel that you sort of nailed those routes down, and then you could sort of get focused on your front end and set up again, 1 line at a time, getting the server set up, getting an Express app set up, integrating your routes, setting up, pulling in Angular, creating an Angular module, setting up a controller, and having that controller rely on a factory. And I really want you to take this sort of 1 step at a time. Try not to do too much. If you're not able to insert and delete employees, then don't bother worrying about the regions, because it just doesn't make any sense. Once you're confident that you can insert and delete employees, then start to focus on being able to get the regions in there. Once you can get the regions in there and display them, think about how you can edit the regions. And then start to think a little bit more about how you can implement some of these business rules. But again, you want to sort of nail down the system before you look at these, what would be added features. I mean, a rule here that says, hey, look, I can't add an employee until they have a territory, right? That's a feature that you could end up adding in later on, but it makes absolutely no sense if you can't end up putting somebody in with a territory, and it makes absolutely no sense if you don't have the basic functionality. So I actually put together a couple of ground rules that I just wanted to point out. Some of these I mentioned already. So focus on 1 feature at a time. And this I mentioned before. And again, your first feature might be, hey, look, setting up your routes. Get your routes set up. That can be a feature. Setting up an Express app, that can be a feature. Integrating your routes with the Express app. And maybe the word feature is not the right word for that, but really focusing on 1 thing at a time as you're building this out. Don't try to build the entire Express application right at the beginning. Focus one line at a time. Every line that you type, I want you to be very judicious with your code. I don't want you to do any copying and pasting. I don't want you to go back to the workshops and copy and paste anything. You could look at the code, but there shouldn't be anything there that's complicated enough that you should have to copy and paste it. And I'll talk a little bit about it in terms of how many lines you really should expect to be doing here. I want you to keep the code tight. So, sort of mentioned before, one line at a time. Look at the line, make sure it looks right, make sure that you're naming your variables correctly. A lot of people aren't focusing on syntax. I want you to look at the syntax. I want you to look at the style of the code. I want you to realize, hey, look, someone else is going to be looking at the code, and the code should look good. It should be pleasing to look at, meaning that you're not jumbling things together. A lot of times I see when people set up variables, they'll do this, right? That's okay, but this is a little bit better, giving a little space here. So small things, but things that end up making a difference. Doing these sort of appropriate line breaks, the appropriate spacing, making sure you put semicolons on the end of lines. It looks, when someone looks at your code and they look at it and they have a linter on, it looks you look like an amateur if you don't put the semicolons in. So, and people look at code when they open things up, they have linters that are part of whatever IDE that they're looking at, and it's really something that ends up jumping out at them. Another thing is I want you to get rid of noise. I saw going through people's code, they had things commented out. They had console.logs there. You might be using those as you're developing. Once things start working, get rid of the console.logs. If you commented them out, get rid of them. Again, you shouldn't have all that noise that's in there. Everything should be pretty tight. Every line should end up counting. So I ended up looking at the code that I wrote, and just to give you some benchmarks here. You shouldn't be writing a lot of code. I mean, for an example, even with good spacing, the routes that you end up creating, we spoke about 4 routes, 50 lines of code maybe. If we end up looking at all your server-side code, so we're looking at your models, we're looking at where you're opening up your database collection, we're looking at your where you're setting up your Express application, and even if you separate out where you're setting up your Express application in your server file, we're looking at somewhere along 100 lines of code. Again, writing 100 lines in one shot is a lot, but doing things one line at a time and testing them out really is not a ton of code to write. And again, you're going to want each of those 100 lines to count. In terms of the client-side code, again, you could end up doing this with one factory and one controller. Your factory is not going to be that big a factory. It's maybe going to be about 50 lines of code, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. Your controller, somewhere along the same line. So, I mean, if you find yourself writing a ton of code to get things working, just maybe rethink it a little bit. I mean, you could go back and look at the solution for the last assignment that we had where, I saw with how people were handling the priority. They had a lot of logic that was going on handling the priority. And if you look at the solution that I came up with, which again might not be, in the end, it might not be the most efficient solution, but it's a solution that basically says, look, here are the items that are in my scope. I'm going to swap these 2 items, and I'm basically going to loop over my list of items, and for every item in my list, I'm going to set the priority. So it turned out to be a much more simple code base. And if it turned out, hey, look, there's too many items here, I'm making too many calls here, you could always go and figure that out. And I think that should probably cover it. But I really want you to go through this and, maybe if you haven't done it before for the first time, really be painstakingly slow in terms of how you end up writing this. If something is not working, I don't want you to write another line until you end up figuring it out. It's very different than doing the workshop where you're modifying an existing code base. Here, we call this greenfield development, and greenfield development is great because it's your code from the beginning, and you're not trying to fit something into something else. You're able to write it, and since you're able to write it, you should really write it with the best practices in mind. And I think it's a very good exercise because it's pulling together all the things that we've looked at up to this point. And so, as you're going through this, you could sort of think about, how this kind of relates to the, what we're doing in the Juke workshop, and how we use the factory there and how we're using it here. And I think it's something that, again, I think you should end up finding to be useful, and you should try to do it on your own. But if you get stuck, feel free to Slack the channel. I'll be online this weekend. I'll see comments, and I think Dan was saying something about having office hours this weekend for some of you. But yeah, give this a shot. Like I said, it looks like if you distill it down and not worry about some of the business rules, it's, there's this little wrinkle of being able to sort of show things as you're adding them, keeping this button disabled until you end up putting something in here. But if you take some of those rules out, a lot of this stuff is things you have seen before. And again, I'm hoping that the more you end up building out these applications on your own, the more confidence that it's going to end up giving you, and the more that you're going to understand what every line in at least your code base does, which is pretty helpful. That's not always the case. I mean, even I'm looking at stuff with Juke where we're seeding data. Some of that stuff is fairly complicated. I'd have to really look at that a bit. But this is your code base, so you're writing it. You should be able to understand, really every line that you ended up writing. And if you feel like you're sort of going down a rabbit hole somewhere, then just sort of step back and you take a break and come back and try to simplify it. If you feel like you're going down, hey, look, you totally screwed up. Hey, delete the folder and start over. It's not the worst thing in the world. But I want everyone to give this a shot. I want everyone to do at least some minimum functionality, and other people that are able to get through it can run with some of these other things. And on Sunday night, I'll end up posting my solution, and I'll deploy my solution so you can end up testing it out. Anyway, enjoy it. I think it should be a fun assignment. Have a great weekend. Bye.